Happy New Year's Eve, everybody, and welcome to our last deep dive of 2024. It's December 31st, 2024. You know, I'm sure a lot of you are out there getting ready to celebrate, but first, we've got to get through one last news roundup. So before we officially say goodbye to this year, let's take a look at some of the top stories that you, our amazing listeners, have sent in. This time around, we're diving into the Videntis, which, you know, if you've been following the show, you know it always has some thought-provoking stuff.
Always does.
Yeah. Let me give you a little preview of what we've got on the docket today. So we're going to be talking about Congressman Andy Kim's push for more transparency regarding the January 6th attack. And then we're going to shift gears a little bit. We'll take a look at some pretty surprising new regulations coming down the pipeline in Oklahoma's medical cannabis industry.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. Then last but definitely not least, we're going to unpack something that I think a lot of people have been noticing. It's that kind of interesting breakup going on between Silicon Valley and the nativist right. Remember how they used to be all buddy-buddy?
Yeah.
Well, things have definitely changed, and we're going to try to figure out why. So buckle up. Let's get started. All right, first up, January 6th. I know. It feels like we've talked about this a million times.
Right.
But Congressman Kim, he's a Democrat from New Jersey, he is saying that we've basically just swept the whole thing under the rug. He's using some pretty strong language here. He says we've papered over the whole thing and that it needs further investigation. Now, here's the thing, right? We had this huge investigation with the January 6th Select Committee. Over 900 people have been charged. Like, a lot has happened since then. So it makes you wonder, what's he really getting at here?
Well, I mean, you've got to remember, right? This event, it was deeply traumatic for a lot of people.
Of course.
And some folks, they feel like we haven't really gotten to the bottom of it. Like, they feel like we haven't had a real reckoning.
Right. And Kim, his whole argument is that if we don't have full transparency, if we don't really understand what went down, then we're basically setting ourselves up to repeat it.
Yeah, I see his point.
Plus, and I think this is really important to remember, you know, we often get caught up in the politics of it all, but 5 people died that day, and over 140 police officers were injured. That's a huge human cost.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I guess the question is, how do we balance the need for accountability with the desire to, you know, move on as a country? Like, is there a way to dig deeper without just reopening old wounds?
It's a tough question, isn't it? You know, I think for me, it comes down to the intention behind any further investigation. You know, is it about genuinely trying to learn from what happened? Or is it, like you said, just about scoring political points?
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction.
Because if it's just about, you know, pointing fingers and trying to get revenge, then yeah, I think that could definitely backfire. But if it's about, you know, trying to really understand how to prevent something like this from happening again,
Right.
then I think it could be valuable.
Okay, so let's switch gears completely. We're going from the halls of Congress to the wild world of weed. Specifically, we're going to Oklahoma.
Okay.
So Oklahoma, they've had this booming medical marijuana industry for years.
Yeah.
Like, it's been wild, right? But now, all of a sudden, they're slamming on the brakes with all these new regulations.
Really?
Yeah, we're talking 10 new laws, all going into effect next year, 2025. And from what I'm reading, it sounds like a pretty big shift.
Yeah, I mean, 10 new laws, that's pretty substantial.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder what's driving it, right? Because in 2024, they had this massive drop in business licenses. Like, almost a third of them just disappeared.
Wow.
So maybe they're trying to, like, rein things in a little bit.
Could be, yeah. Maybe there were some concerns about, you know, compliance or safety or something like that.
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah.
But here's the part that really caught my eye. Okay, you ready for this?
Yeah, lay it on me.
They're going to be using secret shoppers to inspect dispensaries.
Secret shoppers.
Like, what?
Wow.
It's like something out of a spy movie, right?
That's wild. I mean, I guess it makes sense if you're trying to get a real picture of what's going on.
Yeah, but it also seems kind of like creepy, you know? Like, imagine you're a patient, you go to the dispensary, and you have no idea if the person next to you is like a real customer or some kind of undercover agent.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That's a good point.
It just creates this weird vibe, you know? And what about the businesses themselves? Like, aren't they going to be freaking out about this?
No, for sure. And I bet it's going to drive up their costs, too.
Exactly. More paperwork, more training, more everything. And you know what that means, right?
Higher prices.
Higher prices for patients,
Yeah.
which, let's be honest, is not ideal when we're talking about people who are using cannabis for medical reasons.
Right, and this is probably something that patient advocacy groups are going to be really concerned about.
Absolutely. They're probably going to be like leading the charge against this whole thing.
Hmm.
All right, let's move on to our last story for this segment. And this is a juicy one, folks. So remember back in 2016 when Silicon Valley and the nativist right, they were like besties.
Oh, yeah, like two peas in a pod.
Yeah, especially during the Trump campaign. They were like sick as thieves. But now, not so much.
Interesting.
It's like they're going through a messy divorce, and everyone's trying to figure out who gets custody of the algorithms. So what happened? Like, why are these two groups suddenly at each other's throats?
Well, from what I'm seeing, it seems like it boils down to a clash of priorities. You know, tech companies, they're increasingly focused on this global market.
Yeah.
They're thinking about international regulations and all that. But the nativist groups, they're still hyper-focused on things like immigration and social conservatism. And those two things, they don't always mesh.
Yeah, and then you got Elon Musk right in the middle of all of this, like stirring the pot.
Oh, definitely.
He's out there calling for a more balanced approach to regulation, which I think is interesting. But it's not exactly music to the ears of those hardline conservatives.
Right, because they see regulation as, like, the enemy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean? Like, how is this split going to affect the 2024 election? Tech lobbying? Like, is this a sign of some bigger realignment happening in American politics?
It could be. I mean, it's definitely something to keep an eye on. Because if this trend continues, it could have some pretty big implications. It's definitely a landscape that's changing a lot, and it's hard to say exactly what's going to happen. There are so many things happening at once, and it's almost like trying to predict the weather.
Oh, speaking of storms, let's talk about healthcare.
Okay.
So this next article we have here, it really paints a pretty bleak picture of the rising cost of healthcare.
Yeah.
And this is something that affects every single one of us, right? Whether it's us directly, our families, our friends, it's a big issue.
It's true. It's been a problem for a long time, and it's something that everyone's looking for answers on, right? Like, how do we make healthcare more affordable?
Right. And the article really highlights how it's not just a problem for patients, it affects businesses too.
Oh, absolutely.
Because when healthcare costs go up, guess what happens?
Insurance premiums go up.
Exactly.
And that makes it harder for businesses to, hire and retain employees. It can hurt their bottom line.
For sure. And then for individuals, it can be really tough. I mean, the article talks about people having to make these impossible choices between paying for healthcare and like putting food on the table.
Yeah.
Or keeping a roof over their heads. And that's heartbreaking.
It is. And it just highlights, how important it is to find solutions that address the affordability and the accessibility of healthcare. Because it's not just about quality, it's about making sure that people can actually get the care they need.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, let's go back to the tech world for a minute. And specifically, this whole Elon Musk, Steve Bannon thing.
Oh, yeah, that's been interesting to watch.
Because Bannon, he's been pretty much on a crusade against Musk lately, especially over his stance on the H-1B visa program.
Yeah.
Which, for anyone who's not familiar, it basically allows U.S. companies to hire foreign workers for specialized jobs. And this is where you really see that tension between like the globalized tech industry and those nationalistic views,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Because Bannon and others on the nativist right, they see the H-1B program as a threat to American jobs.
Right. Because they're thinking, well, if these companies can hire people from overseas for less money, then what happens to American workers?
Exactly. But Musk, he's always been pretty supportive of the program, right?
Yeah, especially for companies like Tesla. They need to attract the best engineers from all over the world.
Right. So it's like this classic clash of, competing interests.
It is.
Where Musk is saying, look, we need access to global talent if we want to innovate and grow. And Bannon is saying, no, we need to protect American jobs.
Yeah.
And it's tough because there's no easy answer.
There really isn't. It's a complex issue.
And what I find really fascinating is how Musk's position on this, it kind of challenges those traditional ideas of like pro-regulation versus anti-regulation.
That's a good point.
Because He's not really fitting into either of those boxes, is he?
No, not really. He's advocating for something more nuanced. He's saying, look, we need some regulation, but it needs to be smart regulation. It needs to be regulation that encourages innovation, not stifles it.
Exactly. And that's not something you hear a lot from either side of the political aisle.
No, you don't. And I think it's really interesting because it could lead to, new alliances forming, new coalitions.
Yeah, it's like he's throwing a wrench into the whole system. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens.
It is. Because he's shaking things up, that's for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
We've talked about January 6th, the wild world of weed in Oklahoma, the breakup between Silicon Valley and the nativist right, healthcare costs, and even a little bit of Steve Bannon versus Elon Musk. It's been a pretty wild ride through the news cycle.
It has been. Yeah.
What strikes me is how all these stories, they're all connected in a way, aren't they?
I think so, yeah.
Like they're all pieces of this bigger puzzle. And each piece helps us understand the forces that are shaping our world.
I agree. And I think it's a good reminder that, even though these stories might seem separate, they're all part of this larger narrative. And it's a narrative that's constantly evolving.
So as we wrap up this last deep dive of 2024, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling like a lot of things.
Yeah, I hear that.
I mean, there's some hope in there, definitely some concern, a lot of intrigue. It's a lot to process,
It is. It's a real mixed bag of emotions. But I think that's kind of the nature of the beast, right? Like, the world is a complicated place, and there's always going to be good and bad happening at the same time.
True. But I guess the thing that keeps coming back to me is, like, where do we go from here? We've seen how these individual actions, like Congressman Kim pushing for more transparency or Elon Musk's stance on regulation, they can really have a ripple effect.
They can.
It makes you realize that, even in this crazy world, even when it feels like everything's so polarized, our individual voices still matter.
They do.
And I think that's really empowering, we're not just helpless bystanders. We can actually make a difference.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that, making a difference doesn't always have to be about these grand gestures.
Right.
It can be about, having those tough conversations with people who disagree with you. It can be about supporting causes that you believe in, or just staying informed and educating yourself.
Yeah, those things all add up.
They do. They absolutely do.
I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah.
As we head into this new year, let's remember that, there's a lot of uncertainty out there. There's a lot of noise.
Yeah.
But there's also hope.
There is.
And we all have a role to play in shaping the future. So, to all of our amazing listeners out there, thank you so much for joining us on this wild ride through the news this year.
Right.
We wouldn't be here without you.
Absolutely. And Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year. We'll see you in 2025.